before we get underway, I just want to talk a little bit about what was going on in Philadelphia at the time Laurel Hill was established. In 1790, which was the date of the first U.S. Census, there were 42,000 people in Philadelphia. That's the city of Philadelphia, which is sort of what we think of now as Center City. Philadelphia Township was a larger area. Out here, for instance, would be Philadelphia Township. And that didn't become part of the city until 1855. 1790, 42,000 people. By 1830, there were 4 times that many people. There were 161,000. And in the 1840 census, there were over 220,000. So this cemetery was founded in 1836. So there were maybe getting close to 200,000 people here in the city, in a relatively small area. And that, of course, ultimately posed a problem. What are we going to do when people die? Where do we bury the dead? And there weren't enough places. At first, there were churchyards. Churchyards filled up. Sometimes churchyards didn't allow for family plots. They just buried people in the order in which they died. Sometimes people buried their dead in public squares. But that was banned in 1812 because it wasn't for health reasons, for sanitation reasons. Burying people in public squares wasn't good. Then there were potter's fields for the poor who had no other place to be buried. Just as an example, Franklin Field. People know Franklin Field, the football stadium on the Penn campus? That was a potter's field. It was started in 1832, just 4 years before this cemetery. And thousands of people were buried there, 20 feet down, one coffin on top of the next. Then in Philadelphia, in addition to the issue of where to bury people, there was the issue of keeping them buried. There was grave robbing. Philadelphia in the 19th century was the crossroads of the human cadaver industry. Now, why might that be? Because we had 2 medical schools. Penn Med was from 1760. I'm being taped here, so I don't want to get my dates wrong. 1765. And Jefferson was founded in 1824. So there was a demand for teaching purposes for cadavers. Okay, so that's the setting. In the 1830s, a prominent citizen named John J. Smith went to visit the grave of his young daughter at a cemetery at what is now the Friends Center, 15th and Cherry. And he couldn't find the grave. And the ground was soggy. And he was annoyed. They may have built a porch out. For whatever reason, he was dissatisfied. And he had been reading about a new phenomenon, the garden cemetery. The garden cemetery was a totally different kind of place from the churchyard. And it was marked by 3 things. It was in a scenic area with beautiful views. It was far from the center of the city, and it was non-sectarian. John J. Smith felt there should be a garden cemetery in Philadelphia. He joined together with 3 other prominent men, one of whom, Benjamin Richards, was a former mayor of Philadelphia, and he had visited the first garden cemetery, which was Père Lachaise in Paris. Has anybody been to Père Lachaise? Let me recommend it. It's fabulous. Very interesting cemetery. That was the first one. The first in this country was Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that was get my date right, but 1831. So John J. Smith and his partners sought an appropriate space, and they found one right here, the Sims property, 3.5 miles from Center City, Philadelphia, and they purchased it. And they began to lay out the plans for the cemetery. They had a competition to see who would be the architect that they would work with. And they had submissions from two very prominent architects, William Strickland and Thomas Walter. And Thomas Walter is very well known because he was the architect of the dome and the wings of the U.S. Capitol, which has been on TV daily since January 6th. Beautiful dome. So these were two very prominent architects, and they decided against their proposals, and they selected a young architect recently arrived from Scotland, John Notman. And his grave is right over there. I'm happy to show you afterwards if you're interested. John Notman designed this Roman Doric gatehouse, and he set about laying out the paths and the grave plots, and the cemetery open for business. So let's go on. We're going to walk up here. If you can just take a peek in here. This is called Old Mortality, and it is the work of a sculptor named James Thom. And James Thom was from Scotland, and Old Mortality was the name of a book by Walter Scott. And Sir Walter Scott is the man here on the left. And the story of Old Mortality is that was the nickname for this gentleman seated here. And he went around Scotland and re-chiseled the names on the graves of Scottish patriots. So the names had worn away on the stones. These were Presbyterian martyrs, and they had fought against the Church of England. Now, the partners at Laurel Hill thought that would resonate here, because these were patriots. He was a patriot. And we had not that long before been at war with England, not once but twice. They hoped that seeing this artwork, which they purchased and installed here, would resonate with people, and the themes of patriotism, well cared for graves, would perhaps help them sell plots. So they bought it, they put it here, and people came to visit it. It was all part of the marketing, and they would then, they hoped, buy the lots. The lots were at double the cost at any other private cemetery in Philadelphia, and triple what they were charging at Mount Auburn in Boston. So off we go. He died in 1883. He is known for having given the money for the bell and clock tower for Independence Hall for the centennial in 1876. I want to point out that he was the first person who was cremated and had his remains buried at Laurel Hill in 1883. Cremation was practically unknown at that time in the Western world. The first modern crematorium was developed in Milan, Italy in 1876. And that same year, the first American crematorium was built in Washington, Pennsylvania. Has anybody ever been to Washington, Pennsylvania? There is not much there. It is southwest of Pittsburgh. It's not a large place. And so a mere 7 years later, Siebert is cremated. They had to take his body, I presume on the train, to Washington, Pennsylvania. He was cremated. His ashes came back here. Today, more people are cremated and buried here in West Laurel Hill than are the non-cremated. Is the grave of Mercy Carlisle. She was the first person buried at Laurel Hill in October of 1836. She actually picked the grave site a few months before she died. She was a Quaker woman. She was buried, and something like 30 carriages were part of her funeral procession. Again, that was good for publicity and selling of grave plots when you're just getting started. She had a plain piece of marble which wore away, and the Friends of Laurel Hill in 1990 replaced it with this nice stone. So that is the beginning. One of the ways that the partners felt they could make this an attractive resting place was to arrange for famous people, military heroes and the like, to be reinterred here. Hugh Mercer, General Hugh Mercer, is one such person. He fought in the Battle of Culloden, as the monument says. His side lost. He had to leave Scotland. So he came to this country. He served under George Washington in the French and Indian Wars and during the Revolution. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Princeton, and he died 9 days later. He was first buried in the cemetery of Christ Church in Old City. And in 1840, he was reinterred here at Laurel Hill. There was a huge procession when they brought him out. And this next gentleman, who is Joseph Wharton. Wharton was a member of a wealthy Quaker merchant family. He himself was a metallurgist. He made his own fortune first with the American Nickel Company. He had a monopoly on the manufacture of nickel for a time, and he co-founded Bethlehem Steel. And it was the first U.S. Plant to forge high-strength steel. In addition, he was a co-founder of Swarthmore College, but he's best known in 1881 for his donation of $100,000 to the University of Pennsylvania to found the Wharton School. And the interesting thing is, Wharton was a big believer in protective tariffs. He wanted tariffs on the import of foreign goods, and he was not that successful in getting the various government officials to establish tariffs. Today, the two schools he founded, Swarthmore and Wharton, are going with great guns. Bethlehem Steel was driven out of business by imported steel. So that's Joseph Wharton. Over here is the north section, which was acquired second. And we'll see the other two sections as we walk on. But total today, 78 acres in this cemetery. This is Sarah Josepha Hale. She was born in New Hampshire in 1788. She married a lawyer, and they had 5 children in pretty short order. And then when her husband was only 34 years old, he unexpectedly died. She had no means of support. He was a lawyer. She had no obvious means of support, but she had written poems. And so friends of her husband's raised the funds to publish a book of her poetry, and it sold really well. It was the first of over 50 books that she published in her very long life. A Boston editor of a ladies' magazine asked her if she would consider editing his magazine, and she agreed to do so and moved to Boston in 1828. She wrote most of the material in the magazine herself. At that time, she also published a volume of children's poetry, and we all know one of the poems in it, Mary Had a Little Lamb. In 1837, Louis Godey, whose mausoleum is not too far from here, purchased the magazine that she was editing, and with the intent to combine it with his women's magazine published here in Philadelphia. And he offered the editorship to Sarah Josepha Hale. She at first said she couldn't move to Philadelphia until her son graduated from Harvard, but he did, and she moved. And the magazine that she edited, Godey's Ladies' Book, was the most influential and widely read magazine in the 19th century. By 1860, it had a circulation of 150,000. She was the first to copyright every issue of the magazine. And the magazine published articles on fashion, cooking, house plans if you were thinking of building a house. But she also published recipes, other entertaining stories. She also published the work of Poe, Hawthorne, Emerson, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. I always think of her as a kind of combination of Oprah and Martha Stewart. From 1837 to 1863, she lobbied U.S. presidents to name Thanksgiving a national holiday. It already was a holiday in some of the New England states. And in 1863, in the depths of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln named Thanksgiving a national holiday and credited Sarah Josepha Hale for his decision. She was a thought leader in the 19th century. She believed in, she was opposed to slavery. She was in favor of women's education. Interestingly, not in favor of women's suffrage. A very active person throughout her long life. She retired from the Ladies' Book at the age of 89, and within the year she died, which was 1879. So, fascinating person. Pennington. She was born in Nashville in 1872, but her mother's family was from Philadelphia and they moved back here. She matriculated, she started attending classes at Penn in 1890 in chemistry, and she completed all requirements for a degree in 1892, but Penn didn't give bachelor's degrees to women, so she got a certificate of proficiency. But oddly, Penn did allow women to enroll in graduate programs. And she enrolled in the PhD program, and she received her PhD in 1895. Penn was one of the first universities to allow women to matriculate in the graduate program and to grant PhDs to women. She worked for a year at Penn and then at Yale, and then she returned to Philadelphia, and she was the director of the clinical lab at the Medical College of Pennsylvania, then called Women's Medical College. She also started working as a bacteriologist for the city of Philadelphia. She was very active in trying to protect various foods, particularly dairy products. She began working to clean up the ice cream supplies peddled to children, to school children, and taught farmers the proper way of handling raw milk products. Beginning in 1905, she worked with Harvey Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture. And the next year, the government established the Food Research Lab, and that is now the Food and Drug Administration. And Wiley wanted Pennington to be the first director of this organization. He advised her to take the civil service exam, but to sign up using her initials, M.E. Pennington. She did that, and she got the top grade on the civil service exam, and he moved to hire her. When the authorities found out that M.E. was a woman, they balked at that, but he insisted that the person that got the top grade should be hired. And so she worked for the next 13 years as the head of the Food Research Lab. She did research leading to the recognition that fresh foods remain fresh longer if they are stored at a cold temperature.
What year was that?
In 1906 was when this Food Research Lab was established. And it was in the years following that she did this research. Her work helped establish that maintaining low bacterial counts in refrigerated foods such as eggs, milk, and cheese was critical to food safety and purity. She left in 1919. She became a consultant. She got a patent for a device to dry chickens on. She worked on developing refrigerated boxcars. She invented the egg carton that we all use today. At the end of her life, she continued to work on food preservation and started working with frozen foods. She died shortly after retiring in 1952. Harry Callis was born in 1936 in the Midwest. After graduating from college, he joined the service and was posted to Hawaii, where he started calling baseball games on the radio. After he left the military, he decided to make that his life's work. And he ended up as the broadcaster for the Houston Astros. We know him because he became the voice of the Phillies. He came to Philadelphia in 1971. He called the first and last games at Veterans Stadium, and he was much beloved by everyone in Philadelphia. He collapsed in the broadcast booth at Washington National Stadium in 2009, 1 hour before game time. And his family selected this beautiful spot for his grave. The following year, this microphone gravestone was put in. In addition, these seats, these are actual seats from Veterans Stadium, and they were installed here. And when Citizens Bank Park was re-sodded, infield grass was taken up and replanted here. So everyone loves Harry Callis. This is the grave of Frank Furnas. He was born in 1839. His father was the minister of the First Unitarian Church on Chestnut Street. He was a well-known abolitionist. His brother, also buried here, Horace Howard Furnas, noted Shakespearean scholar. Frank Furnas wanted to be an architect. He designed many buildings in New York, and also those beautiful cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, as well as the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina. Frank Furnas joined the Army, and he was a captain in the Pennsylvania Cavalry. He served at Gettysburg. His company pinned down a unit of Confederate soldiers that were to have joined Pickett for Pickett's charge. That was one of the decisive battles within the battle. In the Battle of Trevelyan Station, he volunteered for a very dangerous mission to bring ammunition to another unit that was pinned down by the Confederates. And so at great personal risk, he dodged the bullets and ran the ammunition to this group. And for that, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. he came back to Philadelphia and opened an architecture office with George Hewitt, who had been working for John Notman, the one who was the architect of Laurel Hill. In their office was a young draftsman named Louis Sullivan. And Louis Sullivan is known as the first modern architect. He worked primarily in Chicago. That's where his offices were. And in his offices in the early 20th century was an apprentice named Frank Lloyd Wright. So you can trace modern architecture back to Frank Furnas. Furnas designed about 600 buildings. About 200 of them were railroad stations. You can see today the Mount Airy station and the Gravers Lane station in Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill. He also did some spectacular buildings here that survived. Some of his buildings, unfortunately, were torn down. The Furnas Library at Penn, named after his brother. The Baldwin School, the Gatehouse at the Philadelphia Zoo. Undine Barge Club on Boathouse Road. The Emlyn Physic House in Cape May. But my favorite may well be the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts building at Broad and Cherry. And Furnas was, his designs are sort of sui generis. You can see how the building works, which is a very modern concept. You can see the steel trusses, the iron construction, the sandblasted ornamental design, and there's lots of light. He said he wanted to create a factory for the artists. Just a fabulous, fabulous architect. My favorites, Lily Potter. Lily Potter was the widow of Colonel Thomas Potter. He was sent to Johnstown to supervise the relief efforts after the Johnstown floods. And Lily herself sent a nurse along so that, that the nurse could assist Clara Barton, who was working there. Clara Barton went on to found the American Red Cross, and that became a favorite charity of Lily. Among her children were Olive Potter Crolius, but at the time she was Olive Potter Earnshaw. And when Colonel Tom died in 1910, the following year, December 1911, Olive informed her mother that she was filing for divorce from Earnshaw. And this was a scandal. And so her mother said, Olive, let's take a trip. Let's let things die down. Let's go to Europe and the Holy Land. You can bring a friend. So Olive brought a friend, Margaret Hayes, from her school days, and they went to Europe, and they were in Turkey, and they learned that the Titanic was going to have its maiden voyage. So they canceled their other trip home and boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg. Lily had her own cabin, and Margaret Hayes shared with Olive. On the night that the ship hit the iceberg, the two girls came into Lily's room and said, "What's going on?" And the mother said, "Run up on deck and find out and come down and tell me." So the girls ran up, and they were told they had hit an iceberg, but all was fine and they should go back to bed. Lily would have none of that. She said, "Dress in your warmest clothing, but not your corsets, just in case you have to swim." I'm not sure at that point what difference the corsets made, but in any case, they came back up on deck, and they were told that the captain wanted to lighten the ship for repairs, and they were placed into the first lifeboat. and they actually saw the Titanic sink, and Lily wrote about it after the fact. They were picked up by the Carpathia and arrived in New York, where the soon-to-be divorced Mr. Earnshaw picked them up and brought them back to Philadelphia. Lily, they were divorced, by the way, and then she went on to marry Crolius. In 1916, Lily began a long association with the American Red Cross. She sent prepared supplies to send to the troops and to hospitals in Europe during World War I. Her son, Colonel Wilson Potter, served in World War I. He was a football star at Penn and a big game hunter, and he was sent by the Smithsonian to get heads of various animals. In any case, both Olive and Lily continued to volunteer for the Red Cross. Lily was recognized as their oldest volunteer at the age of 88. She won the Gimbel Award as the Outstanding Woman in Philadelphia in 1939. She never crossed the sea again and died in her daughter's apartment at Alden Park Apartments along Wissahickon Avenue at the age of 98 in 1954. Olive, on the other hand, loved the good sea voyage and traveled many times, especially to Bermuda. She remarried and had 2 children. So, this is William Warner, a coal merchant who died, and we're stopping here because of the Victorian, typical Victorian grave marker, except that this one was designed by Alexander Milne Calder. And it shows the angel propping up the roof, the top of the sarcophagus, and the soul of William Warner escaping. But the angel is missing her arms. In the summer of 2019, the cemetery received a call from a man who said he had a stone hand that he wanted to return to the cemetery. A friend had picked it up while walking here in the 1980s, and the friend displayed it in his home. But the guy had died, and this man said he thought that it should be returned to Laurel Hill, and he brought it in, and they discovered it was the arm, one of the arms of this angel, although minus the finger that was, of course, pointing to heaven. So we hope the other arm turns out. This was the George Pepper estate. It was purchased in the 1860s, thus making the cemetery completely contiguous, because across Hunting Park, South Laurel Hill had already been purchased, and this was the land in between. So in the 1860s, all of a sudden this prime real estate became available, and many wealthy Philadelphians rushed to purchase lots and to build mausoleums here. And so this area is called Millionaire's Row. Robert Carson, because it's a funny story. He died in 1907 at age 62. The headline in the New York Times read, "Drops dead in theater. Robert Carson, Philadelphia capitalist, expires at close of play." Actually, he and his wife were at the Chestnut Street Opera House. Quote, "Shortly after the curtain rose for the final act, Mr. Carson gasped and fell forward in his seat. Death was instantaneous." Well, let's hope it was, because his wife did not summon aid until after the curtain fell for the final act. And the play they were seeing was The Merry Widow.
Oh, Lord.
William Lukens Elkins. He was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, to a Philadelphia family in 1832. The family returned to this area, and he went into the grocery business. And he became a very successful merchant of produce. He became the largest produce supplier in the United States. Like many captains of industry in the Gilded Age, he then branched out into other industries. He invested in oil, which had just been discovered in northwestern Pennsylvania, and he was a pioneer in the refining of crude oil. He became the first to make gasoline, and he was a partner in Standard Oil. In 1873, he met Peter A.B. Weidner. You can see, you step over the mausoleum up here. And they were united in business, in marriage, and in tragedy. Peter Weidner and William Lukens started the Philadelphia Traction Company. They had essentially a monopoly on the streetcar lines in Philadelphia. They also owned streetcar lines in Baltimore and Pittsburgh and other cities. Weidner was not a produce man, he was a butcher, 2 years younger than Elkins. He was such a successful butcher that he got the contract to supply all the meat for the Union Army in this region during the Civil War. And he too became extremely wealthy. They both had mansions in Elkins Park. Elkins Park, named for Elkins. The Elkins Mansion was, for a long time, owned by some Dominican nuns. It's been acquired by a developer going to turn it into a boutique hotel. The Weidner Mansion is, you can drive right by it. It's huge property, over 100 rooms. It's in disrepair, and I don't know what's going to happen to it. Anyway, Weidner, in addition to his streetcar business, was a founder of U.S. Steel. He had holdings in Standard Oil, and he developed one of the most valuable art collections in the United States. His art collection was one of the 3 founding collections of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. His surviving son gave it to the National Gallery. Peter Weidner's son, George Weidner, married the daughter of William Elkins, Eleanor Elkins. And the son was involved in the streetcar business and other civic interests. He established the new Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Philadelphia, and he and his wife decided to go to Europe to interview French chefs for the hotel. And they took along their son, Harry Elkins Weidner, a 27-year-old graduate of Harvard who was a collector of rare books. They came home, or they attempted to come home, on the Titanic.
I know how this one ends.
You know how this one ends. Eleanor and her maid were placed into a lifeboat, and George Weidner gave her his signet ring for safekeeping. He and his son perished. George was just 50, and Harry, as I said, was 27. The signet ring remains in the Weidner family. As recently as 2006, the grandson of George Weidner, Fitz Eugene Dixon, died, and on his deathbed, he gave the signet ring to his wife. Eleanor survived and decided to commemorate her son by giving funds to Harvard University to establish the Weidner Library. Some of you may have been to this huge library on the Harvard campus. It has not been documented that a condition of the gift was that every Harvard student must learn how to swim. Undocumented. It is the case that in 1915, when the library was dedicated, a swimming requirement was instituted. Eleanor, while working with the people at Harvard, met a man named Alexander Hamilton Rice, who was 13 years her junior, and she married him in 1915. He was a professor of geography and he was interested in exploring the headwaters of the Amazon. She accompanied him on these trips to the headwaters of the Amazon, and she was the first non-native woman to venture to some of these parts. At one time, they were attacked by cannibals. If you survived the Titanic, would you be going to the headwaters of the Amazon? Eleanor did. Eleanor Elkins Weidner Rice, in 1937, 25 years after the Titanic sunk, was shopping in Paris at the old Bon Marché department store when she dropped dead. She was 75 years old, and the tour guide joked, she shopped till she dropped. So this is our final stop of the day. You see here 2 gravestones, one for Polly Panino, and Adrian Balboa. One of the Rocky films was shot here at Laurel Hill. In fact, a number of films, you may have seen signs where certain films were shot here and there. But there was a scene from one of the Rocky films here at the cemetery, and the production company had prepared a styrofoam gravestone for Adrian. And when Sylvester Stallone saw it, he said, "That's not acceptable. We need to have a real gravestone." So they went and they made a real gravestone. And when they finished shooting the scene, Sylvester Stallone said, "You can keep it, I don't want it." So here it is, and Polly too. And so if you have friends from out of town who come and they visit the Rocky statue at the Art Museum, please bring them to Laurel Hill and show them Adrian's grave. I want to thank you all for coming today.